You would be hard-pressed to find anyone who really likes high inflation, but you sometimes hear that moderate inflation is the juice for the economy. The truth is that some groups benefit from it while others suffer. We can broadly divide the economy into three groups: the government, businesses, and households. And the key variables are debt, savings, and income, but other circumstances come into play, as you will learn. Here you can see the ratio of debt versus cash of the aforementioned groups, using USA as an example. The government holds very little cash compared to the $35 trillion of debt, resulting in a striking ratio. Non-financial corporations hold over $13 trillion of debt, while their cash stands at some $3.5 trillion. And the US households have almost as much liquidity as debt. It is common knowledge that inflation is beneficial for the debtors. It doesn't change the amount of debt to be paid, but it reduces the real value of it. You might have heard that if there is 10% inflation, it is as if 10% of the debt has been paid. However, what is sometimes overlooked is that inflation helps debtors only insofar as they are able to increase their income. And the various groups in the economy differ in their ability to do so. The single biggest debtor is usually the government. So how can the government profit from inflation? Let's assume there is an economic boom. First way it can make money is directly from taxes. Most countries in the world have either value-added tax or sales tax. So any price increase is immediately reflected in proportional VAT or sales tax collection. The government also collects more corporate income and personal income taxes once those incomes react to the inflation. Second way the government can make money on inflation is indirectly through taxes. Many states have progressive income taxes, with the tax brackets being defined in absolute terms. Even if your pay raise is equivalent to inflation, it may shift you to higher tax bracket, and you will end up with higher than proportional tax increase. On the other hand, tax credits that are set in absolute terms will become smaller as a percentage. In this way, the government can get more than proportional increase in tax collection. At the same time, the mandatory public expenses usually increase proportionally at best, and often with a certain lag. It may take several months or a full year before the public salaries increase. Pensions, unemployment benefits, and other expenses may also increase with significant delay. In this situation, the government is the largest benefactor of inflation. If, however, inflation corresponds with or brings about recession, and consumption falls significantly as a result, the tax collection might increase less than proportionally, remain the same, or even decline, depending on the severity. In such a case, inflation might even end up being slightly negative for the government's income. Nevertheless, recessions are temporary, while the increased price level remains, so the government will eventually collect the benefits anyway. Corporations also hold a significant amount of debt. Let's start again by assuming that there is an economic boom. If inflation causes a proportional increase of costs and revenues, say by 10%, then the company's profit margin remains the same. But again, in absolute terms, the profits will increase by 10%, thus making the debt 10% easier to repay. But inflation is usually not the same across the entire economy. If the company is able to charge its customers 10% more without affecting its sales, but the cost of their product increases by less, then not only is the company's debt eroded, but even the profitability increases. In this case, such a company would be a beneficiary of inflation even if it had no debt at all. Now, the reverse can happen, and the company's costs may increase more than the average inflation. The impact of such situation depends on the combination of the profit margin and the elasticity of demand for the company's product. Price elasticity refers to how much are the sales of products affected by price change. If cigarettes get 20% more expensive, but their sales decrease only 2%, demand for them would be considered highly inelastic. On the contrary, if the sales fell by a higher percentage than the price increase, it would be very elastic. Companies that sell products with inelastic demand should not have such a hard time increasing their price sufficiently to fully offset the high cost increases, and vice versa. Here comes the interplay with profit margin. If companies fear that the price hike would result in significantly lower sales, they can choose to raise the prices by less than the increase in their costs and thus take a hit to the profit margin. However, the ability to do so is crucially dependent on the magnitude of the profit margin. If it goes from 50% to 45%, it is much less of a tragedy than drop from 8% to 3%, which would be devastating. So a company with high profit margin and inelastic demand for its product is okay, while a business with low profit margin and elastic demand is fucked, with the other two combinations being somewhere in between. Now, let's assume there is a recession. It is fair to say that recession makes the entire economy more price sensitive, so companies cannot really afford to increase their prices. Which is why you tend to see low inflation or even deflation during recessions in the first place. But if there is an inflation during economic downturn, let's say due to environmental policies pushing up prices of food and energy, it makes the situation even worse. At this point, it's good to mention that if inflation is above the 2% central bank target, the central banks usually react by increasing their policy interest rates, which then propagate throughout the entire economy. So high inflation can make the debt more expensive if interest rates remain very high for long enough, because floating rates will react immediately and fixed rates will have to be reset after some time. Banks are a unique category of corporations. They have very high liabilities, but they are almost exclusively in the form of deposits of their clients. Most of the bank's income comes in the form of net interest margin, which is the spread between interest rates on deposits and loans. Inflation can be profitable for banks in two ways. First, if inflation coincides with low nominal interest rates, then it incentivizes firms and households to borrow more money, since real interest rates are close to zero or even negative, and the bank can make more loans. Second, if the central bank reacts by increasing nominal interest rates, it will somewhat dampen the demand for loans, which is bad for the banks. However, with higher interest rates, the banks typically increase the spread between the interest rates on loans and deposits, thus making lending more profitable. Deflation and low nominal interest rates is the worst scenario for the banking sector, so they are clearly biased against deflation. When it comes to households, most of them get their income from employment. During an economic boom, especially when the inflation is moderate and demand pull, the wages and salaries tend to increase to fully compensate the loss of purchasing power. However, they do so with a certain lag, and the length of the lag is dependent on the employee's position. Generally, the lower down the hierarchy, the longer it takes. Wages are most commonly renegotiated only once a year. Let's say there is a linear inflation of 2% per year. In such a case, the employees are buying things for ever increasing prices, while their income remains the same, and only after a year it catches up. So even in this quite optimistic scenario, they permanently suffer a loss of purchasing power of 1% on average. During periods of high inflation, the loss can be significant. If there is a sudden price shock, the loss can be also magnified. During stagflation, that is high inflation combined with economic stagnation, the nominal wages increase much less than inflation, if at all, and the erosion of purchasing power is substantial. Many households derive their income from social security. In many developed economies, the benefits are automatically adjusted for inflation. Again, this adjustment typically happens only once a year, so it is equivalent to wages. But the automatic adjustment ensures that unlike wages, the benefits are fully compensated even during a recession. Nonetheless, in states without this automation, the recipients of welfare may suffer the most. We have covered how the income of different groups is affected by inflation. If the debtors increase their income with inflation, their debt becomes smaller in relation to their income and its repayment easier. If unexpected inflation is met with substantial increase in nominal interest rates, the debt service may for some time actually become harder. The longer the debt maturity, the worse the interest rate hike, so mortgages tend to be screwed the most by it once fixed rate adjustments come. Still, over the last 20 years or so, the real interest rates have been the lowest in recorded history, and it can be said that inflation is in general beneficial for the debtors. When it comes to savings, there is almost no scenario in which creditors would benefit from inflation. Even if they had 100% of their savings in inflation-indexed bonds, those would just protect them against losses, so they would just remain neutral compared to no inflation. Cash in the form of banknotes or checking accounts with no interest are hit the most. Interest-bearing forms of savings can benefit from increased interest rates, but they rarely fully compensate the inflation. Again, given that in the 21st century, real interest rates on savings and term accounts have gone down to almost zero and even slightly negative sometimes, it is fair to say that inflation in general hurts creditors. To sum up, governments have a lot of debt and little cash. At the same time, its income increases immediately with inflation, while expenses catch up later. Therefore, governments are the chief beneficiaries of inflation. Banks profit from moderate inflation because it either incentivizes people to take loans, or if nominal interest rates rise, it makes loans more profitable. Businesses are very diverse. The group as a whole has much more debt than cash. But large corporations tend to be much more indebted than small businesses. The income situation depends on the distribution of inflation across various sectors, profit margin, elasticity of demand for the company's products, and current business cycle. So it is hard to make a general verdict, but inflation is certainly better for corporations than for smaller businesses. Households have the largest share of cash. They also have a lot of debt, but most of it in mortgages, which are likely the most vulnerable to interest rate hikes. Expenses of households increase immediately, while their incomes only later. So in general, they tend to be the losers of inflation, again with a lot of variation. For all groups, inflation is much worse during a recession than during a boom. And yet, some economists propagate the theory of dangerous deflationary spiral, which I tried to debunk in the previous video. In the next part of this video, I will show what a long deflationary period would likely bring about. See you there.